who have put together such a great conference. Kevin Ewing has been amazing, keeping things moving. Sorry, I'm a little tall for this mic. And thanks to Jen Mannion for saying what so many of us were feeling yesterday. You really provide a model for what community scholarship can offer. I want to also quickly mention here that the focus of the book project I'm working on now really goes from 1920 to 1960, but my talk today is thinking about more contemporary art and memories about that time period. So this is not actually drawn from my book, and it really doesn't talk about the 1950s, which I'm a little self-conscious about. A young man posed in profile before a video camera, removing his shirt. He looks beyond the camera, presumably glancing towards a director whose commands are replaced with a narrative voiceover. Even in an unlikely place, filmmaker William E. Jones intones, it is possible to find traces of recent history. The subject of Jones's 1998 film, The Fall of Communism as Seen in Gay Pornography, is the sex industry's rise in post-communist Eastern Europe, a visual symptom of the region's uneven entry into free market capitalism. The fall of communism coincided with the rise of the adult home video market, introducing a labor crisis in which sex workers in cities such as Prague, Budapest, and Moscow often earned 1/10 the wages of their American counterparts, and coercion became the norm. Rather than emphasizing the new sexual liberalization that might have been expected to greet citizens of exuberant new democracies after decades of ostensible totalitarianism, Jones's film instead uncovers an archive that exposes new channels of exploitation and desperation that emerged in the hardscrabble environment of post-communist economies. If the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 inaugurated, as Francis Fukuyama optimistically and incorrectly predicted, the end of history, Jones's archive of post-Cold War gay porn offers a somewhat more complicated narrative. American queer artists found themselves in a unique position after the end of the Cold War. On the one hand, Western liberalism asked gay people to conceive their liberation as the terminus of history, a distinct counterpoint to the repressive dimensions of the communist bloc. But in spite of pressure to define gay identity as a celebrated byproduct of Western values, a more complicated history emerged. Jones's film offers a uniquely queer aesthetic response to the fall of communism, and by relying exclusively upon existing video clips, indexes a specifically archival impulse that collapses public and private forms of cataloging and commemoration. Since the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the intertwined histories of homosexuality on the left have been reopened to scrutiny. That history turns out to be more thorny than it had previously appeared. In 1936, for example, the American communist poet John Malcolm Brennan wrote a letter to his boyfriend Keeman Fryer, also a communist, from his pilgrimage aboard a ship bound for the Soviet Union. "Russia looms great before me now," Brennan typed upon a piece of stationery emblazoned with a red banner, "and I am ready to meet it full-hearted. Hold with your communist lover, Keeman. You are more to him than manifestos, banners, or 1,000 nations." Far from being exceptional, Brennan and Fryer joined a veritable Comintern of gay communists and fellow travelers who saw in the Soviet Revolution the potential of liberation for their comrades and lovers. "We shall exult with love like ours," Fryer wrote back to Brennan, "flaunting the transatlantic breeze, poet whose resolute songs foment hammer and sickle through risen shores, planting a joyous blossoming peace where we may lie together in the end." Others lyricized similar hopes for a queer communist revolution. Willard Moss, a communist bisexual poet and later filmmaker, wrote a verse equally suited to a reflection on the Paris Commune or a guidebook to New York's homosexual underworld. Quote, "Out of the classroom past the factory wall, they stand upon the platform in the square, erecting barricades against the night." Fellow communist Jim Kepner erected his own barricades against the night throughout the 1940s. One such evening, he met, quote, a tall, fairly handsome young radical in Pershing Square who, quote, seemed to be very knowledgeable about Marxism and radical history. Kepner was, quote, inspired by his virile good looks and superior knowledge and, quote, invited him to my party meeting. The geography of his recollection is hardly incidental here. As Kepner notes, quote, Pershing Square was one of the chief centers in the country for public open-air debate, free from police harassment, and also popular for gay cruising. The same might be said for Washington Park in Chicago, where cruising happened among the trees behind where Marie Houston lectured on Marxism to massive crowds of black radicals. It was, in fact, the black communist John Pittman who in 1932 published the first defense of homosexuals that connected their struggle to the black liberation advanced by third-period communists in his article, Prejudice Against Homosexuals. Later, in 1937, communists David Gillis Kelly and Jack Mayall shipped out together to fight with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The couple was affectionately known by their fellow volunteers as the Dolly Sisters, and their comrades noted that the two were rarely found away from each other's company. Meanwhile, a letter writer published in the 1935 issue of the communist New Masses connected his liberation as a homosexual to his regular reading of that magazine. It's not hard to see why. In 1927, for example, Agnes Smedley published an article detailing her lesbian affair with Florence Tenenbaum. Their relationship began with, quote, a sort of massage to get the kinks out. 1 year later, New Masses published an article titled The Red Commander, which described an American woman who, after joining the Communist Party in Budapest, quote, shaved her head and, quote, bandaged her breasts so they would not be noticed in order to join the Red Army. No wonder, then, that Ben Reitman noted of the campy relationship between homosexuals and leftists in Hobohemia, quote, two male homos will meet a radical and say, you know, this is my wife Ella, or I brought Kitty along, she is looking for trade. What is most remarkable about this history is how thoroughly these archives have been buried in a post-McCarthyist historiographic dragnet that has cast the Communist Party as, among other things, an entirely hostile space for queer women and men. In fact, with a few notable exceptions, the place where queer left intersections have been most thoroughly dissections has been not only in history books, but within post-socialist art, both domestically and internationally. The art world has been compiling its own ad hoc collection of gay American history, following their notable forebear, Jonathan, in politicizing the archive and using the moment following the Cold War's end to rethink queer politics and lives over the past century. Certainly the range of international artists producing queer aesthetic archives is robust and continues to grow. Bratislava lesbian artist Anša Dalšíková, for example, produced a 2014 installation that invited viewers to sit at a small desk in an empty room and put on headphones transmitting descriptions of sexual scenes in Soviet Russia. The scenes describe queer experiences that are framed as documents from the state archive. As when, for example, quote, Comrade Dalšíková approaches a Soviet official in 1984 and demands citizenship in order to continue her affair with a Russian woman. Quote, in Moscow, the senior officer announces, quote, in the most progressive country in the world, I say with real pleasure, right decision, congratulations. In Dalšíkova's work, the Soviet Union becomes a space that is highly sexualized and defiantly queer. Her archive resists narrative closure that cuts off sexual liberation in the Soviet imaginary, or that sees the end of communism as a victory for sexual liberation. That queer archival impulse might also be found in Estonian artist Jamu Sama's 2015 installation, Not Suitable for Work, A Chairman's Tale. The piece consists of photographs, videos, an operetta and built theater box, and 167 documents relating to a gay communist official from the 1960s. Since 2007, Sama has documented Soviet Estonia's gay history in his work, and in this piece he moves seamlessly between preserving documents from the communist past and producing an effective archive that acknowledges the highly charged eroticism of sexual liaisons in the highest echelons of Soviet power. As with Dalšíková, Sama refuses to erase the complicated dimensions of sex under communism or to capitulate to a narrative of Western sexual liberalism as triumphant. American artists have, oh, sorry, those are the documents. And those are more of the documents. American artists have been similarly invested in developing transnational archives. Slava Mogutin, for example, a New York-based gay artist who was expelled from Russia in 1995, photographed subjects in portraiture and uniforms that invoke the Soviet past while celebrating the youthful energy of a generation that has almost no memory of the socialist state. A 2001 photo depicts an insouciant young man holding a Soviet-era flag featuring Lenin's childhood portrait. It helps to know that queer Russians often referred to Lenin as Aunt Lena during the Soviet years. Indeed, the flag's kitschy image somewhat resembles a Victorian aunt. The archival dimensions in this work emphasize the banality of history by offering a snapshot that unsettles both the pageantry of the Soviet past and the purported liberation that greeted the lifting of prohibitions on homosexuality after communism fell. Yet the impassibility of capturing the past in a state that no longer exists creates an uncomfortable engagement with the politics of memory. This queering of the past resists the kind of nostalgia Svetlana Boym describes in her work on post-Soviet culture, offering instead an aesthetic reinvestment in historic taboos. Perhaps more directly, in his photographic project, Moscow, New York-based artist Yevgeny Fix, quote, addresses the historical promise of the October Revolution for the queer community. Fix photographs pleshkas, gay cruising sites such as public toilets and parks that were also significant sites of communist history. They recall the kinds of intersections Kepner found in Pershing Square. Though he positions them as, quote, sites of mourning, Fix develops a queer aesthetic archive of absence that depicts benign scenes haunted by the specter of deviance. Significantly, Fix admits the inextricability of queer and communist histories. His photograph of Sverdlov Square, for example, foregrounds a large statue of Karl Marx that in the 1970s and 80s was referred to by queer Soviets as director of the Pleshka. This queer reading of Marx has not been written into official histories of the international left, yet the Queer Aesthetic Archive envisions a reclamation of this revolutionary impulse, the historic promise of the October Revolution to offer an alternative to Western neoliberal gay identity politics. Though much of what I've been discussing to this point represents a literal cataloging of documentary objects, I also want to consider how queer aesthetic archives inform post-Cold War art and reframe the historical memory of queer politics. Avram Finkelstein, a founding member of the Silence Equals Death Project, famous poster there on the right, created Headscarf in 2013. This piece incorporates several archival elements, the banner of the Daily Worker from 1941, along with other repeating motifs, red flags, and industrial symbols from revolutionary Russia, a man launching a Molotov cocktail during the White Night riots, mechanical cogs that resemble T cells connected with the epidemiology of AIDS. Multiple histories of revolution, American and Russian communism, gay liberation, AIDS activism, are collapsed in the headscarf, the utilitarian function of which plays with the contradiction between the functional, the documentary, and the aesthetic. The piece indexes Finkelstein's family history of communist membership. His parents were communists and neighbors of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, and his personal history as a red diaper baby informed Finkelstein's queer activism, most notably in his invoking anti-fascism to produce the Silence Equals Death poster as part of a collective. In other pieces, such as Worker's Apartment, Finkelstein, oh, sorry, there's the detail. So Finkelstein similarly collapses archives from gay and leftist history into furniture, textiles, and wallpaper to produce compelling narratives about the leftist past and queer present, framed in seemingly banal domestic tableau that, upon closer investigation, are freighted with historical meaning. I want to conclude by turning to Dan Fishback's play, The Material World, an off-Broadway musical that debuted at New York's Public Theater in 2012. Fishback's time-jumping piece delves into the radical Jewish left in the US to elicit connections between left-wing commitment in the 1920s and contemporary queer popular culture. Focusing on a young communist girl in the past and a gay radical in the present, the play insistently collapses the revolutionary history of the left into postmodern queer culture. The musical opens with Gittell Fenster pining for the revolution alone in her bedroom in 1928, a light piano theme referencing the theater of Brecht and Weill, as Gittell reflects on the workers' struggle. And I was going to play a piece of one of the songs, but I don't think I have audio here. By the end of the play, the mantle of revolutionary change has not disappeared, but it has shifted. Gittell's gay leftist grandson reads revolutionary subtext into songs by Madonna and Britney Spears, seizing the means of production through queer world-making. The message of pop music to, quote, put it into work, the title of one of the songs in the play, is revealed to carry on the project of the old left, rather than pitting the queer contemporary against the antediluvian radicalism of the past. Fishback reads the pop canon as harboring a queer aesthetic archive that offers an unlikely site for rethinking recent history and mapping a queer futurity. While the recent language of human rights has asserted the primacy of Western sexual values aligned with liberalism as intimately connected with gay identities, queer aesthetic archives interrogating homosexuality in the left challenge the notion that the politics of sexuality follow an unbroken path towards liberation. As Jonathan Ned Capp taught us 40 years ago, archiving queer history creates a foundation for radical social change. And as the artists I discussed today similarly suggest, mining the queer left past might also provide unlikely tools for envisioning a future that places queer lives and radical politics at the center rather than relegating them to the dustbin of history. Thank you.